The 1980s. Big hair, neon lights, bigger shoulder pads, and maybe the biggest villain speculative fiction had seen yet. This was a prime time of my growing up, and it's going to be so fun to spend a little time in it with you now. This decade gave us undead sorcerers the size of mountains, soul drinking swords, hive minds, corporate tyrants, political puppet masters, and a razor spiked time traveling metal nightmare from the far future. Some of you know who I mean. Today, we're counting down the best fantasy villains and the best science fiction villains from every single year of the 1980s. 10 years, 20 villains, zero mercy. Hey everyone, Jim here. Welcome back to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where my son Zach and I like to talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and other nerdy things we enjoy. Just Jim, the father, here with you today. If you enjoy villain spotlights, decade retrospectives, and a little nostalgic fun with your speculative fiction history, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Huge thanks to our Patreon supporters who help fuel this channel and keep the evil forces of chaos at bay. If you'd like to join our Patreon fellowship, check out the link down below. Before we dive into this decade of excess, let me quickly explain again how this list works. You might not have caught the previous episodes on the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but you should go back and check those out if you missed them. For each year of the 1980s, I have chosen one fantasy villain and one science fiction villain. But these villains did not have to debut in that year. Instead, each of them had to be widely recognized and discussed during the specific year, so the fandom was quite aware and loving on these villains or hating on them or whatever. They had to be a clear villainous force in the source material they come from, and they had to represent the decade's flavor. These have vibes of what the 80s was about for those of us digging fantasy and sci-fi. I really love that I'm rolling into the 80s now because I'm feeling 80s vibes. If you're watching this right when it's dropping, Stranger Things final season is about to start this week. So this is perfect. So crank up your synthwave playlist. We're heading straight into the neon-splashed mayhem of the 80s. For 1980, the fantasy villain I'm bringing to you is Oran's forces. As Lloyd Alexander's Prydain continued thriving in classrooms and libraries, Oran's demonic huntsmen and Anuvin's shadow forces dominated YA fantasy discussions. Their relentless mythic presence made them iconic villains for a new generation discovering the series in 1980. For science fiction, I've got the Tyrell Corporation. With a film adaptation in the works, Blade Runner came out in 82, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep saw a resurgence of interest in the early 80s. This introduced more readers to the Tyrell Corporation and its cold, corporate arrogance, manufacturing replicants, controlling lives, and deciding who is human. Tyrell became a defining villainous institution as cyberpunk rose. In 1980, their reputation for engineered cruelty was everywhere in sci-fi chatter. For 1981, I'm giving you one that people were shouting for in the previous decade, but I saved him for here. Lord Fowl. Stephen R. Donaldson's cosmic nihilist villain surged in visibility as the Thomas Covenant series hit massive paperback circulation. His psychological cruelty and world-ending ambitions made him one of the most terrifying presences in early 80s fantasy. I do agree. Those of you wanted to see him, here he is. For science fiction, The Puppeteers. Larry Niven's manipulative, cowardly alien masterminds returned to popularity with the Ringworld Engineers, first seen in Ringworld. Their galaxy-wide schemes made them standout villains in 1981's hard sci-fi landscape. 1982. Interesting, my fantasy choice is a throwback. The White Witch. A major revival of Narnia in the early 80s put Jadis back in the spotlight. Cold, immortal, tyrannical, and unforgettable. Her icy grip returned as one of the most widely recognizable fantasy threats of the year. Also in 1982, science fiction There Can Be Only One, a little bit of a cheat, but you'll forgive me. Roy Batty. Exploding into cultural consciousness via the movie Blade Runner, Roy Batty became an instant icon, a stylish, philosophical, tragic villain. His fierce intelligence and violent desperation made him the most talked about sci fi antagonist of 1982. While not strictly tied to a novel, the inspiration for this character still lies in Dick Stew Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. I'm giving myself a pass on this one. 1983, the fantasy villain of the year is the Dark Powers from Shannara, or Shannara if you really want to, get on Terry Brooks' good side. With the Elfstones of Shannara driving huge bookstore sales, the Warlock Lord's shadow forces, and the immortal demons of the Forbidding coming to us from both these first two books were everywhere in fantasy circles. Shannara's blend of apocalyptic danger and pulp flair helped make these characters the key villains of 1983. Science fiction for 83 is the MCP, the Master Control Program. Introduced to us in the movie Tron and expanded upon in the movie's novelization, the MCP became one of the first major digital tyrants, authoritarian, calculating, and chilling in its logic. In 1983, as computers entered everyday life, this early cyber villain captured imaginations and fears alike. 1984, the fantasy villain goes to the Dominator. In the Black Company series, Glenn Cook unleashed one of fantasy's most terrifying undead overlords, ancient, sorcerous, and apocalyptic. Readers in 1984 immediately recognized the Dominator as a villain on par with the darkest lords in the genre. For science fiction, Big Brother. Come on. 1984. We're in the real year. It triggered a global spike in sales of George Orwell's masterpiece, making Big Brother the cultural villain of the year. Omnipresent, oppressive, and terrifyingly plausible. No science fiction antagonist dominated conversation more deeply in 1984. 1985, the fantasy villain goes to the Worm. Barbara Hambley's Dragon's Bane delivered a dragon unlike most in fantasy, ancient, cunning, calculating, and terrifyingly aware. Readers praised the Worm as a standout villain of 1985, rich with personality and menace. For science fiction, I'm giving you the Formics, also known as Buggers. With the release of Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game as a full novel, the Formics became one of the most widely discussed alien threats in modern sci-fi. Their hive mind nature, tragic misunderstandings, and monumental war with humanity defined 1985's sci-fi conversations. For 1986, one of my favorite fantasy villains, Raistlin Majere. In Dragonlance Legends, Raistlin stepped away from dabbling with heroism and went full on into villainy. Ambitious, brilliant, tragic, and frightening. 1986 readers considered him one of the most iconic fantasy antagonists of the decade, and perhaps the best character the writing duo of Weiss and Hickman have ever created. Tell me I'm wrong. Sci-fi? This one's a little deep. The villain goes to human institutional cruelty. From Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card, the second book in the Enders saga. The true villain of Card's Speaker for the Dead is the cruelty humanity inflicts on those alien pequeños through fear, prejudice, and violent misunderstanding. The book's moral complexity made the systemic, human-driven villain one of 1986's greatest sci-fi discussion points. I needed to read this book twice to fully appreciate the real villain here, and it's amazing. 1987, the fantasy villain goes to the Crimson King. There's been more than one with that title. Where am I going? Stephen King's expanding multiverse made his Crimson King increasingly visible. A chaotic, omnipresent force pulling strings across reality. By 1987, thanks to the first two books of the Dark Tower series especially, he was recognized as one of dark fantasy's most intriguing meta-villains. Science fiction for 87, the Adiran Empire. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's how it comes out for me. In Ian M. Banks' Consider Phlebas, book one of the Culture sequence, the Adirans, devout, war driven, and unbending, became the ideological powerhouse opposing the culture. Their role as antagonists defined one of the greatest space operas of the decade. 1988, fantasy villain goes to Rakoth Mogrim. Guy Gavriel Kay's chained god of chaos, the Unraveler, became widely celebrated as one of the great modern Dark Lords, as more readers discovered the Fionavar tapestry. In 1988, his mythic weight made him a favorite among epic fantasy fans. Science fiction, 1988, is another deep one. The Union Political Genetic Powers from Sci-Teen. Cherry's Sci-Teen revealed one of the decade's most chilling human-made villainy. Political dynasties using cloning, conditioning, and psychological engineering to control society. Villainous! These institutional forces captivated sci-fi readers with their cold, horrifying logic. And finally, we come to 1989, where the fantasy villain of the year is the Storm King, also known as Inaluki. Tad Williams' The Dragonbone Chair kicked off a new epic fantasy era, and the Storm King's undead hatred set its tone. By 1989, Inaluki was widely discussed as a terrifying and emotionally rich new Dark Lord. But science fiction? One of the best, absolutely, of the decade. This villain is the Shrike. The metal nightmare at the center of Hyperion stole the show in 1989, time-traveling, unstoppable, alien, and unknowable. Instantly iconic, the Shrike became one of the greatest villains in science fiction history the moment it appeared. And there you have it. The best fantasy and science fiction villains of the entire 1980s, in my humble opinion, year by year across one of the most explosive decades of genre evolution. Which villains from the 80s stand out the most for you? Are they on this list, or do you have others to suggest? Put them down in the comments. Watch for the episode zooming in soon on the 90s, a decade of grimdark beginnings, cyberpunk peaks, and some of the most chaotic SFF villains ever. If you enjoyed this villainous walk through science fiction and fantasy history, don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that bell, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and beware undead kings, corporate replicant overlords, and anything with too many time-traveling spikes. We'll talk to you next time.